Welcome everybody. My name is Magdalena Ljung, and a warm welcome to John Rainey. We are so glad, we're so pleased to have you here and your exhibition. You are an Irish sculptor. You're Belfast based.
Yes.
And this is your second solo show at the gallery. And the title of this exhibition is Stage Shift. I would like to ask you what that means to you, what this theme, this title means to you, Stage Shift.
Absolutely. So the title of the show is kind of functioning for me on a number of different levels. You know, when I was preparing the show, I was thinking a lot about the time in between this show and my previous show in the gallery, which happened just at the very end of 2019. And so since that time, especially in the UK, we've lived through a period of social restrictions, and we're sort of witnessing these swings to the right politically, which are things that I don't think any of us in our lives before this really imagined happening. And that sort of sense of shaking what we understand as certain and fixed is a really important theme for approaching this show. It's also true, I'd say, of the way that I'm working with historical sculptures over the last number of years. So these are forms that are generally associated with kind of stability and certainty, and there's a really long history of these forms being copied ever since at least Roman times. And I'm looking at those kind of patterns, the sequence of reproduced sculptures as a kind of pattern, and it's a pattern that I'm kind of hacking into, breaking down and reimagining as a way of kind of thinking about alternatives.
Yes, can we speak in particular about, if you choose one sculpture here, and speak about its pattern and its various layers?
Yeah. Well, a key one to mention is in the center of the room we have this version of a Venus, which is actually a combination of a number of versions of Venus. You know, she's a kind of collision of different ideas and representations about Venus over time and in different media. So it's combining two different Venus sculptures with a famous Botticelli painting of Venus with the hair.
Sorry, is everybody aware of which sculpture we are speaking about?
Yes,
the one
that's the central platform. Yeah. So it's a kind of collision, as I say, of these different versions of Venus, united in a single form that I think is maybe somehow familiar to how we might, sort of things we might see if we Googled a term like Venus. So these ideas of like digital amalgamation, disrupted patterns are very strong themes throughout the exhibition.
Yeah. I'd like to ask you in the beginning about Ireland and how it was growing up there and working there now as an artist.
Well, I mean, there's definitely a lot of challenges of being an artist working in Northern Ireland. We don't really have a lot of funding for artists particularly. I'm really sort of in awe when I learn about the Swedish models for artist grants. I think it's incredible, the system that you have here. Northern Ireland is still quite a politically unstable place, and one of the consequences of that is a lack of investment in the arts, I would say. But it's not, you know, I don't mean to paint it like a very doom and gloom situation. Like, there's lots of nice things about working in the art scene in Belfast. There's a really active, supportive artist community there, and you know, in the last year, in 2021, a group of artists from my generation were the first Northern Irish artists to win the Turner Prize, which is one of like the most prestigious prizes in the art world. So that's been like a very exciting thing for the art scene in Belfast. And what it's also done is kind of put on a world stage the kind of issues that artists are working with there. You know, it's not a very socially progressive place, so it's only in the last year or so that we've got legislation for women's reproductive health care, access to abortion services, equal marriage, and so these kind of issues and a kind of legacy of British colonialism as well are really strong preoccupations for artists there. art and activism really go hand in hand in the city. And I think that's an interesting point to make about the context that I'm making this kind of work in.
Yeah, exactly, because speaking about feminism, when we are approaching theory now in your work, you're inspired by feminist theory quite a lot, and you're mentioning 2 books that has been crucial to you for your older works, that is the Cyborg Manifesto from 1985, Donna Haraway's book, and for your more recent works, that is Legacy Harris and the Glitch Feminist Manifesto from 2020. So can you briefly tell us about these 2 books and what you take, what inspires you?
I mean, I think it links a bit back to the last question as well. Like, one of the preoccupations that Irish artists are working with a lot is to do with identity politics. It's obviously a place that's been divided for years on religious grounds, and so both of these texts were interesting to me because of the way these writers think about identity, right? And with the Cyborg Manifesto, for me personally, coming from an avid queer perspective, I find Donna Haraway's use of the cyborg as a kind of representation of a rejection of rigid boundaries. That was something that really spoke to me in my early work. And then I think Legacy Russell is working with very similar themes, but she's focusing on it through more of a lens of the digital era that we're living in now. So she's thinking about identity in terms of glitches and errors, kind of disruptions in the system of white, male, heterosexual identity that has kind of dominated for years. Another really important thing for this show that she talks about is the idea of remixing with original material. So if you think of music, like how the remix works there, she proposes other ways of thinking about remixing that are creating something new and something liberating from something that's already there. And so that's been really important for me, thinking about the way that I'm working with these historical sculptures.
Yes, and those historical sculptures, I mean, the classical heritage is a baseline in your work. How come it is so? How does it happen?
Well, I think it originates because I've always had a real fascination with the man-made body, the manufactured body, how it's been, how people have attempted to represent and reproduce the body over time. Also, I have a real interest in the fragmented body, and that led me to the classical around, I'd say, 2017. That was a time when museums and collections started releasing these really high quality scans of important sculptures in their collection. And it was like really incredible to suddenly have this access to these 3D forms. I sometimes think about it in terms of how people working with collage must have felt in the 1960s when there was this boom in printed media, just suddenly having this availability of lots of material. And then the year after that, I was spending 6 months on residency in Rome, and in the run-up to that, I sort of had this sense that it was going to be like a pilgrimage to the originals of these kind of forms that I was starting to work with. But I quickly kind of realized when I was there that the really interesting story for me was about the role of the copy, which is such an intrinsic kind of thread in the fabric of Roman sculpture, right? And I've said before that I felt like I was kind of bouncing around between these originals, like marble copies, printed versions of books, images online, digital scans, and it was this constant system of things referring to each other, and that felt very representative of the post-internet experience, basically how we experience things differently since the internet.
Yeah. So repetition is crucial to you, essential. And in this show, correct me if I'm wrong, but we have like five versions
Yes.
of the Discobolus.
So there's 1, 2, 3 behind you, 4, and one this side of the room as well.
In Swedish, diskuskastaren, Discobolus.
Yeah, that's that one it is.
So what do you gain by repeating forms?
Well, I think I've always had this fixation that I think I can trace back to childhood with the idea of multiplication and manufacturing. You know, I've always had this real curiosity with how things are made, and that really led me to the sort of industrial processes that I'm working with, like slip casting and more recently 3D printing. You know, these are processes that are essentially designed for repetition. And so that's been part of the language of my work ever since I started working, I would say. Then you have the Roman tradition of producing copies. Again, it implies repetition in itself.
Yeah.
But I think that, you know, one thing that I really like about that is that my copies here are in a way descendants of those copies that came before. I like this idea of like lineage in sculpture. It feels like it's connecting sculpture more to the human experience in some ways.
Yeah.
I also think that when you multiply an object, it kind of intrinsically changes it, right? And suddenly you have this thing that is referring to something else. And I think that's a real interest for me. I think I'm less interested in the individual object and more about how it relates to other things. And that comes, I think that comes through most apparently when it comes to these kind of exhibitions where you're staging these forms in relation to each other, and there's this like matrix of associations.
Yes. Yeah. So let's continue to speak about your working process.
Yeah.
Because we have the 3D scanning and a strong interest in craftsmanship. Preoccupation with materials, various materials, and tell us how you do the sculptures and what you use in your studio.
So there's a number of stages that happen with the making of these kind of works, and they begin with the digital scans. To take those into the real world, that requires kind of preparation in CAD software, design software, and then 3D printing. So in case of the printing I'm doing at the minute, it's working with like a liquid resin, which is fused by light, like lasers, and that produces a 3D object. Then from that stage, I'm producing plaster molds, like quite intricate work, in preparation for slip casting, where the work becomes ceramics. And in a lot of these works, there's an extra stage of surface printing. So there's lots of steps and lots of states that it's shifting through.
Yeah. And the materials like Parian porcelain you're using?
Yeah, so Parian porcelain is, I like to think of it as a kind of imitation material in itself. It was,
sorry, those sculptures are made of
these are made of Parian porcelain. Yeah.
And
the history of that
Yeah.
I find interesting and like sort of enriches the work a bit because it is a material that was developed in the 19th century by British manufacturers specifically for creating these kind of sculptures for middle class homes essentially. So what it's trying to imitate is the Parian marble that the originals would have been produced in, but in a more accessible material and on a more accessible scale. Which kind of dictates.
What material is that?
It's called Parian porcelain.
Oh yes, Parian.
Yes. Yeah.
So when people think about porcelain, it's a glossy material to think about, but they're not shining. They are more stone-like.
Exactly.
The surface is more.
Yeah, it's not often used with glazes, which you get in other types of porcelain, because it has like this gentler sort of sheen naturally because it's got a kind of glass content in it.
Yeah, exactly. All right, and then when your sculptures are formed and ready, then you color them. And how do you think about color? Because it's a prominent
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the reasons I colour my sculptures is because there is, like, as we know, this myth of classical sculptural whiteness. We know from research now that a lot of these forms were highly coloured when they were originally produced, just that the colour doesn't survive. So in a way, my use of colour is a bit of a nod to that. But I also enjoy working with it as part of, I think it's another language that you can use within sculpture. And I'm developing that now. I obviously work with base colours often, but I'm developing that now with the use of surface pattern and print also.
Right. And before I ask you about your previous exhibition, we forgot to speak more about some particular sculptures in your show. So do you want to pick some examples and tell us more deeply about them?
Yeah, so we can talk about these pieces here, which go back to what we were saying about repetition. You know, we obviously have the 5 versions of the Discobolus here, but this is a version of the Lansdowne Hercules that's been repeated. And as I was saying about the repetition changing the object, what I find really interesting then is that, you know, what becomes interesting about the work is the differences between the work, and you see that with a work like this.
Yeah.
Subtle, but the more time you spend with it, you start to realize that there's variation built into that process of repetition in my work.
Yeah.
Where I'm kind of working against the original intention of those processes.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. And also this crouching figure here with this pattern on her. What kind of pattern is that?
So it's a pattern that's actually called dazzle. It has a name. It's sometimes referred to as a kind of camouflage, but it's not trying obviously to disguise the piece. What it's doing is trying to. It was often used on warships in World War II, and the intention was to kind of confuse the enemy about what direction the ships were moving, how fast they were moving, and so it's about confusing a sense of orientation, and I've built that into this kind of matrix of confusion that's happening with the repetition and the reconfiguring of the sculptures also.
Yeah. All right, and comparing to your previous show, held here 2 years ago, it is not 2 years ago, it was in 2019.
Yeah, no, almost exactly.
It was called Flayground. To flay, to peel one's skin off. So Flayground. What was that about?
Well, the exhibition started off, it was an exhibition in 2 parts. The first section of the show that you met was kind of retrospective in a way. It was composed of pieces from the previous 10 years that in some way had a sense of this like flaying, which was something that I was working with much more when I was in Rome, and I had started working more intensely with the classical figure. I was producing a series of sculptures based on the Doryphorus model, which is very
that is
famous.
spjutbäraren in Swedish.
Exactly, yeah. But I was combining him with other references that I'd been researching in Rome. One of those is the historical tradition in painting and sculpture of using flayed skins, like peeled skins, as a kind of metaphor for change and transformation and also strength sometimes. So there was this connection I was making between those ideas about change and transformation and the sense of like shifting between new identities, you know, bringing it back to the identity politics that I mentioned earlier. Also thinking about the ways that those forms I was using have kind of shifted meaning over time, like as they changed location and context. The skins almost became like a stripping away of old meanings and development of new meanings.
Yes, so both your exhibitions are about something in transit, something changing, stage shift and playground is one from one stage to another.
And I think in this show that focuses a little bit more on movement. So we have the idea of the shift patterns. A lot of the figures in this show appear to be more in motion than they did previously. So yeah, that's one of the big developments.
Going back in your life, I would like to ask you about your education, because like many artists, you have been at various faculties and spent several years. You began at Manchester Metropolitan University and then continuing to the Royal College of Art in London. You also you visited Sweden, the glass and ceramic department at Konstfack. It was an exchange program, and also on a visit or exchange to Rome at the British School in Rome. And what do you carry from those schools? How did they influence you, and how did they differ? What was?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all a kind of build up of our experiences in the past, and each of those really did offer something different. So the first degree that I did in Manchester was in a course called Contemporary Crafts, and so that really featured a lot of material training. I was actually working with 4 materials then. It was ceramics, wood, metal and textiles. And then, progressing from there, I moved to the Royal College in London, which was an MA, a bit more focused on ceramics. But it was a place where they also really encouraged people to work in an interdisciplinary sort of way. So that was where I began to introduce 3D printing into my work. Then moving over to Konstfack. That was a really nice opportunity. It was short, but like a really lovely opportunity to see how things were done slightly differently in another country, whether that's like slight technical differences in processes, some of which I picked up and kept, and I'm still doing today. But it was also interesting to see how ceramics was almost viewed differently in this other context. Sometimes at the time, working in the UK, you could sometimes feel that ceramics had this almost marginal outsider position, and it's something that I felt less when I moved to Stockholm for those months. It's the wrong word, but working with materials almost seemed cooler in some way. Like there was more respect for it. So that was lovely to see. And then there was a bit of a jump from that in 2013 to the British School, which was, I think, 5 years later. And that was a totally different context. It was my first time working without ceramic facilities, so they didn't have kilns. You were provided with a lovely art studio, but I had to kind of think of different ways that I could work in that space and different materials that I could use that were more immediate and required less processes. So I began to work with silicon and jesmonite in quite an experimental way, but in a way that there were aspects of that I was able to take back into my ceramics at a later stage. So yeah, quite varied experiences.
We are getting to our last question here about the future, about what's happening next.
Yeah.
How do you, what kind of, what do you learn from having this show, and how will you continue now?
Yeah, well, I think with any solo exhibition, I always try to end it in a way with a kind of a suggestion of the direction I might be going. And with that, for me, there's a piece also on that central plinth, but further back, which is that piece in this show. It was the final piece that I made. And I would say, you know, I'm working increasingly with more forms than I was in the previous show. And what that allows me to do is have this archive of molds that suddenly I can pull from and make these more disrupted fantastical kind of compositions that merge multiple forms. I think that's one of the directions I'm planning to move with the work. Another thing is at the end of this month I am delivering my first commission in marble back in Ireland, and so I've just received some research money to work a bit more with the CNC milling technology that is used in that process, with the aim of introducing those materials into my kind of material language, if you will. And I think that's quite an exciting prospect, because these are materials that I've been, in a way, imitating through surface pattern and decals, like I've used in the piece behind you there. So I feel like it's going to be this kind of confrontation between the imitation and the real, which is part of the themes that have already been operating in my work.
All right.
Yeah.
So we want an applause, and then we want questions. So please.